is that people really struggle with how to move forward on this. Quick poll for everybody who's on the call so far. Do most of you feel comfortable as a point and click kind of administrator or developer, or do you feel comfortable getting into the code? I'd like to get an understanding of who we're talking to today. So if you could just type that out inside of the in the response area with the questions, then that would help me understand a little bit about who we're actually communicating with today. Okay, so I'm seeing lots of point and click. Some people are okay with coding. Mostly point and click. All right, and that's usually what we see. So that's pretty standard, pretty normal. And what we typically have whenever we encounter companies that prefer to do things in more of a declarative fashion, we get a lot of frustrated users on the Salesforce platform. Not that the Salesforce platform is bad or difficult to use, but sometimes from a user perspective, we don't quite understand why things are so hard, right? Have your users ever said, I don't understand, just add a third column. How hard can that be? Right? And so from an administrator's perspective, you're like, no, but you don't understand. It's going to require this whole thing called Visualforce, and it's more difficult than just adding a third column. And so we get into this kind of rut where users become extremely frustrated when they're asking for changes on the Salesforce platform. And this can come from either maybe you've got a process where users have to submit kind of changes to you, and then it takes you a little bit of time to prioritize them in your active work queue, and then when you do get around to it, it maybe takes you a week or 2 weeks to build everything out, and then when you deliver it to them, sometimes it's exactly what they wanted, and other times they're like, well, this isn't, I know I said 3 columns, but that's not exactly the 3 columns that I meant. We've all kind of been there. And so we get this bad rap as admins or as developers for just taking a long time to do anything. And so we have this whole new thing called Lightning coming out, right? And I've been working with a lot of companies, and some of them are very hesitant to make any kind of changes with Visualforce because they don't know when they're going to switch to Lightning. Maybe some of you are in that same boat. And a lot of the hesitation typically comes from, since we're point and click kind of admins and some of us are developers, then it becomes a very large time and energy investment to create Visualforce pages, and we're not sure when we're going to make the switch to Lightning, in a year, 6 months, or whatever that timeline is for you. So we're not sure if we want to make that investment, that time commitment, into making some of these changes. And this is really where I would petition to you that you should look at design tools of some kind to assist you with this process. Now, in particular, I'm going to have a slight bias towards SkyVisualEditor. That's just how it's going to be. But there are other design tools that are out there, and I would highly recommend looking at what's at your disposal. Whether it's a development IDE that helps you actually speed up the coding process, or whether it's applications like SkyVisualEditor that will do a lot of that coding for you, you just need to figure out how to get your hands on it, because one of the problems that we typically see with companies who choose to not customize in favor of saving a little bit of money or trying to wait it out and then eventually get into Lightning and hope that solves the problem is that their adoption rates drop and they plummet. This typically comes from users who are really frustrated with the fact that they want things a certain way and it's just not happening. So maybe they're kind of like what I've seen in the past, where people will just switch back to Excel or back to the other thing that they were doing, before Salesforce. And so we're missing a lot of data inside of Salesforce, or as far as the adoption rates of the different parts of the platform go, because we're hesitant to develop and to customize because it takes so long. And that's understandable. So that's really what we're going to be talking about as we go into this demo, is coming from the perspective of how do we create these rich user experiences that the people want without it costing a tremendous amount of our time. Money aside, the time is the thing that you can't get back, and that's usually what we're hesitant about accepting on a lot of new projects and a lot of things in our queue, because we just don't have the time for it. So we're going to look at a couple of pages real quick, and I'm going to talk to you from maybe a user's perspective real fast, and kind of discuss some of the things that maybe your teams are asking for. And if so, then probably you should consider finding, like I said, some way of helping them understand how to get this into their toolkit without it costing a tremendous amount of money with implementation partners, or taking 5 weeks for you to figure out how to do Visualforce, that whole thing. The first page that we're going to look at here is a fairly simple account page layout. Now, I've done a little bit of overhauling of this page. As you can see, it doesn't quite look like the standard Salesforce page, but this is an example of the kinds of things that you can build out with Visualforce very quickly and easily if you use design tools. Now, if you're going to try and reproduce exactly what I've built here, it's going to take you several hours. Even if you're a really, really good developer, it'll take you several hours to rebuild what I've done here. If you're not a good developer, probably a couple of weeks to try and redo what I've done. But we're going to cruise through this, and we're going to actually rebuild this page because it's going to illustrate a lot of the problems that your users have, and then potentially even talk through some of the solutions. Usually one of the big ones that we see is that when we get into custom objects of any kind, people tend to create new fields, and a lot of them. I've worked with several customers that have hundreds of fields on an object, and that can be from a user perspective, quite overwhelming. Anything above 50 fields in Salesforce becomes quite a lot because you have 2 columns worth of data if you set it up that way, and it's a lot of scrolling. 25 fields vertical length is quite a bit to handle when you've broken it up with sections and related lists. It's just a lot of data to parse through. So typically, I see that people really get bogged down in the minutia of the job, right? They just can't figure out how to do their task effectively enough because they can't find the data or whatever their excuse is. What I'm recommending here is figure out in Visualforce how to get into the 2, 3, 4 column setup where you can actually present data in a way that's more streamlined for the user. You can have sections inside of a Visualforce, the custom UIs, where you can actually give them a 3 or 4 column view within a desktop mode and then shrink that down to a 1 column view in tablet or mobile view. So it's very simple to accommodate both form factors within both Visualforce and Lightning if you ever choose to go that path. And really allow your users to find the information they need quickly and efficiently so they can get their job and get back to doing their work instead of hunting around for data. The second major portion in here that we're going to discuss is the tabs. This is something that a lot of people don't even know exists within Salesforce Classic. It doesn't with the standard UI, but it does within Visualforce. So within the Visualforce application, or the framework I should say, we have the capability of implementing some things that are rather, I guess, natural for us to think about in terms of design and layout. For example, tabs, when we think about a browser or we think about other applications that we use, we just expect there to be tabs to organize information. But that's not really a thing when it comes to objects in Salesforce. If we think about our accounts, which we're looking at here, if I wanted to organize all of my contacts inside of a tab, so it's really simple to do and set up, that's not possible within the Salesforce's default UI. But it is within Lightning, so thankfully they're changing some of that moving forward. But within Classic, so until you make that switch, within Classic, it's not possible until you switch over to the Visualforce side of things. So this just allows users to have data that's organized in a way that's really intuitive. And here's why that's really important, is the less you have to explain the changes, the easier it is for people to pick up and adopt. Okay, so if the people have to get trained by you on how to use the new UI, you're probably doing it wrong. Just a tip. Okay, so if you have to have a training day, that probably means it's still too complicated. Because if you think about your own personal experience, maybe this is just me, maybe I'm a guy who just doesn't like to ask for directions, when I'm lost, that kind of thing. But whenever I go into a new application, I don't typically look at the instruction manual and I don't typically look at help docs. I'm probably not the only one, right? And so I just fumble through and try and figure things out. And if I can't figure it out, it's too hard, right? And I typically will leave or just say, that thing is really complicated, and I exit the application, right? And that's a lot of what happens with users when it comes to Salesforce. They're not properly trained, But on the reverse side of that, they really shouldn't have to be. If we're designing things appropriately, the user should be able to just click around and figure things out pretty easily, assuming that they understand the basics of Salesforce. Right? So when we're looking at a page like this, it's very natural and easy for a user to look at the tabs and understand exactly the kind of data they should be getting. So it's very simple to add in organizational structures like that within a page without causing a tremendous headache for you as an administrator. The other big things that we hear quite frequently are that people want to edit records across they want to edit multiple records across a single object, or they want to edit multiple records across multiple objects, right? So let's say that you're editing the account. You want to add in a new opportunity, 2 new contacts, and a related, let's say, note or some kind of task to follow up and do some other activity later on. That typically will require you to open up 4 or 5 different windows, and it just takes a little bit of time. Not that it's difficult, not that it's hard, it just takes a little bit of time to do all of that and several windows. Well, within the Visualforce framework, you can actually consolidate all of that data entry into one single spot for the users. So again, if we're coming back to the fact that your users are asking for these changes, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It may be difficult because you don't know how to use Visualforce, but again, this is where the design tools come in. Allow the design tools to assist you with building out some of these really custom things. There's a lot of great free resources out there as far as IDE and design environments. So if you ever feel like digging into the code, there's a lot of great Salesforce IDE supplements that are out there to assist in helping rapidly figure out how to build some of this stuff. But if you're not looking at that because code scares you, or if you don't ever want to go down there because it just takes too much time and you don't want to have to deal with with Apex code coverage and things like that, then this is really where the platforms like SkyVisualEditor and some of the other ones on the App Exchange kick in, is that they're here to expedite sort of that design process. So all of what we've just shown you on this page is simply to say these are the kinds of things that we commonly hear people asking about when it comes to making Salesforce changes. And this is not just a small thing. This is a lot of sweeping changes across a lot of companies, big and small, that we hear about. The other big one that we really see that we're not going to cover today, but I do want you to be aware it's available. It is something that you can only do with Visualforce, and most people have no clue that it's even an option. And that is the ability to add in forms directly inside of Salesforce. We're going to have to do an entirely separate webinar on this thing, but I want you to be aware that it's actually possible. When you are looking at adding in any kind of form into the Salesforce platform, there's usually one standard method that people go with, and that's to reproduce the physical pen and paper document via a custom object and lots of custom fields. All right, we've all kind of been there, done that. And so we create a page that's like this with our custom object and our custom fields. The problem is this particular screen that I'm looking at, as nice as it is to capture the exact same data, is not the same experience as what people had on pen and paper. So if I can take an actual document itself, place it into Salesforce, and then overhaul the entire user interface to look like the document, what we're seeing here on this screen provides a significantly better user experience for the user when it comes to understanding what they're filling out. And this could be on both the internal user side, maybe in your community aspect of things, but please understand the idea is that we want people to fill out information more efficiently. We want them to ask fewer questions. And so if we can remove some of the roadblocks that they're mentally having with putting in the data, then that would be significant advantage for us. One of the things that we typically see here is that when there's a huge change cosmetically, then people don't know what to do and they panic. And so we're looking at things like, going from a form like this loan application into Salesforce. That's a big cosmetic change. The data is the exact same. The fields are exactly the same. But how it looks and how it's represented is very different. So when we can put in a document like this and keep the cosmetic, just the visual aspect of it the same, and the data is all being captured the same way, then we have just removed a very large hurdle that the users are mentally experiencing with some of the change. So again, we're not going to have time to dive into this, but I do want you to be aware if you're about to go into any kind of implementation using documents of any kind, it is possible to do that within Salesforce. And so keep hunting for solutions because it's really a great method to be able to do some of this internally. But let's go ahead and reproduce some of this stuff. Now, like I said, I'm going to use SkyVisualEditor, but there are other IDEs, there are other development platforms out there on the App Exchange, but the one that we're going to be putting in today with SkyVisualEditor is focused more around administrators who prefer to do point-and-click kind of development work. Some of the other ones that are out there are more tailored toward developers, great platforms, just tailored toward developers. And so we're going to be honing in on what it looks like to actually build some of those custom interfaces using design tools instead of raw code. Same result, same end code that would be created as if you'd hand typed it, but you're going to do it in a fraction of the time because you're leveraging something that's, again, more of an aid for you to build everything out. Now, if you've ever used anything like a design environment like Visual Studio or, I dare say PowerPoint, just any kind of application where there's some kind of componentry on the left that you drag onto the canvas, you're going to feel pretty at home with SkyVisualEditor. So what we're going to do is click File, and we're going to load in an existing page layout. In this case, we'll choose the account object to work with, but it could be any standard or custom object that you want. And you're going to choose the record type to import in as a kind of foundational starting point. So in this case, I'll choose master, and it just loads everything in. Now what we're going to see here, if I scroll up to the top, is the page layout that the user would experience inside of Salesforce. We've simply imported that in and converted it into a base Visualforce page. When this actually gets sent to Salesforce, it doesn't override your layouts, it doesn't convert anything for you, it just simply exists inside of Salesforce. So we'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes. On the left-hand side, you've got a series of components that you can physically drag onto the canvas to make some kind of cosmetic change. This is why I was saying it's very much like Visual Studio or like a PowerPoint kind of solution where you have things that you're dragging onto the canvas to create a visual effect. On the right-hand side, you have a series of properties that you can change. We've tried to keep the properties only to the things that are most popular. So some of our developers that work with us, they're like, I don't understand why you can't add in this one really small thing for us. Well, it's because you and 5 other people use it. That's why, right? And we don't want to clutter the UI for the sake of helping a developer handle a very small use case and then overwhelm a bunch of us that are just point-and-click kind of admins. So the entire process that we're going to go through today is tailored toward those of us who understand Salesforce but do not want to get into code, right? And the developer side of you, for those of you who said that you're okay with getting into the code, there are extension portions of our platform where you can dive into the code to your heart's desire, but it's not the default thing that people are going to see when they enter the platform. Let's go ahead and make some of those changes that I was talking about. Let's say the columns at the top. To do this, you would simply select the account information where the 2 columns are, and on the right-hand side, there's a property to then change it to 4 columns, or 5 or 6 or 30, however many columns you'd like. I would recommend keeping it 5 or below, just for the sake of your user's sanity, but you can go as big as you'd like. Now in this, once we've created the 4 columns here, we then can drag things around on the canvas, very similar to the page layout editor that you have inside of Salesforce already. Just the end result is going to be actual Visualforce code compared to a layout that already exists inside of Salesforce. So it's a very, very similar process. Again, we're tailoring this specifically toward the users that already understand the Salesforce platform and they just need to more effectively customize things. So as you can see, we've now got 4 columns. We can add things wherever we'd like. Let's go ahead and add in something like the tabs. If we go over to the component area here, there's a section where we are able to add in a tab panel. And if I drag that onto the canvas, we now can begin organizing content inside of these tabs in such a way that it's very intuitive for the user to experience rapid navigation of the layout. Here's what I mean by that. if your user needs to go find all of the information at the bottom of the screen for related list, then it becomes a hassle when they always go to the exact same 2 or 3 related list. You know how on sometimes when we have those objects like an account where we are always looking at the contacts, we're always looking at the opportunities associated with them? Well, if that's the case, why not put that up near the top where the user can quickly see that so they don't have to scroll around all over the place to find it? Again, if we're thinking about how to expedite the user's work and layout and design of things, then we should consider how best to help the user with those kinds of experiences. Things like the notes and attachments and other things that are less commonly used, still important. Maybe they stay at the bottom. But the things that users always look at, that stuff should be readily available at the top of the screen, front and center in their UI, so they don't have to scroll anywhere to find it. So we're going to do that today. I'm going to click on tab number 1, and on the right-hand side there's the title for this section. Let's call this our contact data. Okay, and then I can scroll down to the bottom and I can find the related list. I then can drag this upward and then place that inside of one of these tabs. And this allows us to then have the contact-related information near the top of the screen. We can do the same thing for tab number 2, where maybe here we want to have, we'll call this Opti data, just to abbreviate things. And we're just going to drag the same thing for the opportunity. And like I said, the rest of that stuff can stay at the bottom. It's important, just it's not the thing that users commonly look at, so it can stay down there. Tab number 3, maybe the user has data that they don't like the organization of fields inside of Salesforce. I remember I was working with one of our customers that has 30 to 40 fields on their account record where they track different purchase habits that have taken place every single month for that customer for a rolling 12 months. And they want to be able to look at a snapshot of that 12-month purchase in something that looks like Excel. And for whatever reason, related list wasn't good enough for them, and so they were really struggling with how to get the information presented in something that looked like Excel to prevent their users from doing all the data entry inside of Excel and calculations there. So what we can then do inside of Visualforce is they have a section called a panel grid, and this allows you to then create something that looks or feels like Excel. Now, it's not going to have all of the same functionality as Excel. It's not VLOOKUPs and stuff like that, but it does allow you to at least organize and structure things in the rows and columns format. So if you then need to have 2 fields side by side for evaluation and headers across the top of the columns, you can do that. And it's very effective at creating something that looks and feels like a grid layout for people to work with. Here's an example of what this looks like. Let's take the employee field and drop it into column 2, row 2. When I put this into a panel grid, the label goes away. And now we then can go to the first tab on the left, and we can either add in labels as the headers for the rows or the columns, but we get that choice on what we're going to do. So let's go ahead and find the employee one, and we'll add it to the top here. And just like you would typically see inside of Excel, you can then center that content, and there we go. We now have the ability to create a listing of employees just like you would in Excel if you had those fields. So again, trying to think of ways that users are customizing and working with the platform is very effective. Let's go ahead and let's say that we're done designing a page. There's lots of things that you can do as long as you're willing to play around and mess with some of the properties here. Well, we're not going to have time to go into most of that, but let's go ahead and get this into Salesforce so you can see what this looks like. You'll click File and then Deploy. And you're going to tell it whether you're going into a sandbox environment or your production environment. Very simple. So we're going to click Deploy here. And then this is going to save this page inside of the platform, inside of the SkyVisualEditor platform. And the reason that we do this is that you have, more than likely, multiple organizations that you manage everything from. For example, if you have a sandbox or 2 sandboxes in production, you have 3 separate organizations where you're managing content. Since our design studio doesn't reside in any single organization, we actually can control all 3 repositories worth of Visualforce pages in one location, which means we can deploy them to any of the three as well without having to leave the studio. So it's very handy for that kind of management of pages. Once you're done designing the pages in either your sandbox or production, whatever your deployment process warrants, you then can click Open. And this will allow you to see the page that you've built very quickly within just a couple of minutes here. Now, what we showed previously was it was blue and gray color tones. This one looks like a typical Visualforce page without any CSS added into it. So if you have custom styling that you'd like to add in, you can do that. Or you can use some of the basic styling elements that are inside of the platform as well. So I would recommend look at SLDS if you guys want something that looks like lightning, or if you have your own internal branding standards, you can use that as well. Across the top, as you can see, we have the 4 columns worth of data. Then right below that, we have the internal tabs, which is the contact and the opportunity data. And if we're looking at the contact information right here at the top, I even have the ability by default to inline create records at the exact same time. So while I'm working with an account, if I need to give users access to create or update content for their contact records, they have the capabilities of doing so. Now you may be asking, well, where's the full name? Well, technically speaking, within Salesforce, a full name is a display-only field. If you want the users to input the full name, they really need to input the first and last name separate, and that's the data that's comprised of the full name. So you would replace the full name column with the first and last name, and those would be data entry fields here. The opportunity data section is the same thing. We can add in opportunities at the exact same time across all of the objects that we have listed here and have that data represented. And then the tab. Tab 3 is where we added in that Excel grid. And again, this is just to show you what it looks like to put things inside of a rows and columns format. It's a little bit different than what Salesforce typically has out of the box. So if we need to provide that, that is available for features that users can leverage within Visualforce. It's not something specific to SkyVisualEditor. We just simply create the Visualforce code on your behalf. This is technically something that you can do with or without our platform. Once you're done designing everything, this page is available inside of your environment. You now get to decide where it goes. So like I said, it doesn't override your page layouts by default. You then have to decide which things you're going to do with it. Is it going to override a tab or a layout? Is it going to go into your mobile applications? You're going to have to pick and choose and assign them wherever it needs to go. So what we're going to do is we're coming up on time. I'm going to go ahead and leave the next couple of minutes available for Q&A. So for those of you who are planning on sticking around, we'll have the Q&A section here. I'm going to stop the recording, however, in case we go into safe harbor territory. But we're going to stop the recording. This will continue going for the next probably 5 to 7 minutes as we answer questions, but this stuff will not be recorded. So if you need to hear the answers to some of these questions, stick around because it won't come out whenever we send this out a little bit later this week. So with that, thanks for attending, and we'll start the questions. One moment.